Russian officials say the U.S. seizures are illegal after Washington confirmed boarding and taking control of at least 2 tankers. Russia's foreign ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova has called the blockade and seizures piracy and banditry, according to Russian statements and international reporting. Russia's transport ministry said U.S. forces boarded the tanker and contact was lost, calling it a violation of maritime law. Russia's foreign ministry says the ship was in international waters and far from the U.S. coastline when it was tracked. Russia says the ship was Russian-flagged and operating lawfully. U.S. officials say the operation was tied to sanctions enforcement. Russia argues there was no legal basis to use force against a foreign-registered vessel, citing the UN sea law framework. Russia's foreign ministry warned the standoff could spiral into unpredictable consequences, urging de-escalation. Russian officials say they want to challenge the seizures through legal and diplomatic channels. A Russian lawmaker criticized the seizure as illegal, according to Russian media. The claim can't be independently verified. Russian officials say any maritime enforcement should be handled collectively, not unilaterally. Russia argues U.S. court warrants shouldn't apply on the high seas. Washington frames the seizures as lawful sanctions enforcement. Russian state media claims the tanker was operating legally. U.S. statements and tracking data are cited by outlets as the basis for the seizure. Some outlets reported heavy U.S. surveillance and a major operation. Specific aircraft and special forces details are not independently confirmed. Moscow describes U.S. sanctions as illegitimate because they seek to control global energy flows. Russia has proposed bringing the case to the International Maritime Organization and the United Nations for multilateral debate on maritime security. Russia's response has not been limited to diplomatic protests. U.S. officials and major outlets reported Russian naval vessels, including a submarine, were in the area, but key details remain disputed. The Transport Ministry has formally demanded that the United States cease the persecution of Russian tankers. Reports say Venezuela has considered naval escorts for some shipments. There's no confirmed detail about troops on board. Russian commentators claim monitoring has intensified. Independent confirmation is limited. This reported military dimension transforms the tanker dispute into something potentially more dangerous. The Kremlin has pointed to its strategic partnership with Venezuela and says it remains supportive as the crisis escalates. Moscow has denied rumors of evacuation of diplomatic personnel from Caracas. After earlier seizures near Venezuela, Russia had already demanded answers from the United States. The foreign minister insisted that discussions on drug trafficking and maritime security must be collective, not unilateral. Moscow rejected U.S. accusations that the tankers supported foreign terrorist organizations, calling them pretexts for imperial plunder. In recent months, multiple interceptions and pursuits have been reported by international outlets, raising tensions in the region. The pattern of confrontation has been building. The situation appears to be escalating. Russia has issued diplomatic protests, and reports describe nearby naval activity, a mix that analysts warn could raise miscalculation risks. Moscow is seeking legal and diplomatic channels to challenge the seizures. The Kremlin maintains support for Venezuela despite U.S. pressure, and Russian officials warn of unpredictable consequences. The seizure of tankers is no longer just an economic issue. It has become a potential flashpoint. Each side is hardening its position. Neither shows willingness to back down. The risk of miscalculation grows with each passing day. The United States has seized a major oil tanker linked to Venezuela's sanctioned crude trade. The Marinara, a supertanker capable of carrying enormous quantities of oil, was captured in the North Atlantic. The interception took place in a zone between Iceland and the United Kingdom. This vessel was Russian-flagged and directly connected to Venezuelan petroleum exports. It had been under U.S. surveillance for weeks. The seizure represents a dramatic escalation in Washington's campaign against what it calls the Dark Fleet. The Marinara has a significant history. It previously operated under the name Bella One. Under that name, it was already sanctioned by the United States for transporting Venezuelan crude oil. It was also linked to Iranian petroleum shipments, another heavily restricted cargo. The vessel changed its name, a common tactic used by ships trying to evade identification and sanctions enforcement. But U.S. intelligence continued tracking it. The name change provided no protection. American forces knew exactly what ship they were targeting. The location of the interception is significant. The Marinara was captured in the North Atlantic between Iceland and the United Kingdom. This indicates the tanker was likely heading toward European markets. Alternatively, it may have been positioning for a ship-to-ship transfer at sea. Either way, the route took it far from Venezuelan waters. The vessel's operators likely believed distance would provide safety. They were wrong. U.S. forces demonstrated they can intercept dark fleet tankers anywhere in the world. The capture of the Marinara was not a spontaneous action. U.S. forces had been tracking the vessel for weeks. Intelligence assets monitored its movements across international waters. Surveillance aircraft and satellites tracked its position. The timing and location of the interception were chosen carefully. This was a planned operation with significant intelligence support. When the moment was right, U.S. forces moved in. The vessel was boarded and taken into custody. The Marinara is classified as a supertanker. These vessels are among the largest ships on the ocean. A supertanker can carry over 2 million barrels of crude oil. At current prices, that cargo is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Seizing such a vessel represents a major economic blow. It's not just the loss of one shipment, it's the disruption of an entire logistics chain. The Marinara employed classic shadow fleet techniques to evade sanctions. These techniques are well known but difficult to counter. Ships turn off their transponders to avoid detection by maritime tracking systems. They conduct ship-to-ship transfers at sea, moving cargo between vessels to obscure its origin. Frequent flag changes make tracking difficult. Name changes, like Bella 1 becoming Marinara, confuse identification. False documentation about cargo and destination is common. The vessels often register with flags of convenience from countries with minimal oversight. Despite all these evasion tactics, U.S. forces successfully tracked and intercepted the Marinara. The Marinara was already under U.S. sanctions before this seizure. It had been formally designated for transporting Venezuelan crude oil in violation of American restrictions. It was also linked to Iranian petroleum, subject to even stricter sanctions. The vessel's operators knew they were breaking U.S. law. They continued anyway, relying on the dark fleet network to evade enforcement. They calculated that the risk was worth the profit. That calculation proved catastrophic on January 7th. The Marinara seizure is not an isolated incident. It follows a pattern established in recent weeks. In December 2025, the United States seized the skipper off the coast of Venezuela. This earlier operation signaled the beginning of an aggressive new campaign. Caracas immediately denounced the skipper's seizure. Venezuelan officials called it an act of piracy. But Washington ignored the protests and continued its campaign. Venezuela's government has been vocal in its condemnation. Following the skipper seizure, Caracas accused the United States of piracy. This terminology is legally significant. Under international law, piracy involves the illegal seizure of vessels on the high seas. Venezuela argues that U.S. actions meet this definition. Washington rejects this characterization entirely. American officials cite sanctions enforcement and counter-narcotics operations as legal justification. The legal debate continues, but the seizures continue as well. The skipper was not the only vessel targeted in December. Other sanctioned tankers, including the Sentries, were detained starting December 10th. These vessels were also accused of smuggling Venezuelan oil in violation of sanctions. The pattern shows an accelerating campaign. December saw initial seizures establishing the precedent. January saw the seizure of the Marinara, a major supertanker far from Venezuelan waters. The tempo and ambition of operations are both increasing. The military buildup supporting these operations is substantial. The aircraft carrier USS Gerald Ford has been deployed to the Caribbean. This is one of the most advanced warships in the entire U.S. Navy. Its presence provides air cover, surveillance capabilities, and a powerful deterrent. The carrier strike group includes multiple escort vessels, destroyers, cruisers, and support ships. This represents a major projection of American naval power in the Western Hemisphere. The deployment of the Gerald Ford is part of a broader military buildup. Coast Guard cutters have increased their presence in Caribbean waters. Navy destroyers and cruisers are patrolling key shipping lanes. Surveillance aircraft are monitoring vessel movements across the region. This buildup serves multiple purposes. It supports interdiction operations against the dark fleet. It provides muscle for the capture of tankers like the Marinara, and it sends an unmistakable signal to Venezuela and its allies. These seizures are part of a named military operation. Operation Southern Spear is designed to crush illicit trade in the Western Hemisphere. The operation targets multiple forms of smuggling. Oil from sanctioned nations, Venezuela, Russia, Iran, is a primary focus. Drug trafficking is also targeted under the same operational umbrella. The goal is comprehensive disruption of illegal commerce throughout the region. The Marinara seizure falls squarely within this framework. Operation Southern Spear reflects a broader strategic vision. The Trump administration has prioritized control of the Western Hemisphere. This includes military operations like the recent capture of President Maduro. It includes economic pressure through aggressive sanctions enforcement, and it includes maritime interdiction against the Dark Fleet. All these elements work together as a coordinated campaign. The seizure of the Marinara is one piece of a much larger puzzle. Understanding the Dark Fleet is essential to understanding this story. This term refers to a network of aging tankers used to circumvent international sanctions. The fleet transports oil from countries like Venezuela, Russia, and Iran. These nations face severe restrictions on their petroleum exports. The Dark Fleet allows them to continue selling oil despite sanctions. The vessels operate in shadows, avoiding detection, changing identities, falsifying documents. They are the lifeline that keeps sanctioned oil flowing to global markets. For Venezuela, the Dark Fleet is an economic lifeline. U.S. sanctions have severely restricted Venezuela's ability to sell oil through normal channels. Major international shipping companies refuse to handle Venezuelan crude. Global banks will not process payments for sanctioned petroleum. Insurance companies will not cover the cargo. The Dark Fleet provides an alternative to all these obstacles. It allows Venezuela to generate revenue despite the blockade. Disrupting this fleet directly impacts Venezuelan government income. Every seized tanker represents millions of dollars in lost revenue. Russia has responded to these seizures with outrage. Moscow accused Washington of state piracy following the tanker operations. Russian officials argue that the United States is illegally seizing vessels in international waters. They claim this violates fundamental principles of maritime law. More significantly, Russia is reportedly studying options for military escorts. This could mean Russian naval vessels accompanying tankers to deter U.S. interdiction. Such a development would dramatically increase the risk of confrontation. The possibility of Russian military escorts is significant. If Moscow deploys warships to protect Dark Fleet tankers, the situation changes dramatically. U.S. forces intercepting a vessel escorted by Russian Navy ships would create a dangerous scenario. Neither side wants direct military confrontation, but neither side has indicated willingness to back down. This escalation pathway is now being actively discussed in both capitals. The stakes are rising with each seizure. The White House has defended these operations vigorously. Officials link the tanker seizures to counter narcotics efforts. They argue that Venezuelan oil revenues fund drug trafficking organizations. Corruption is also cited as justification for the aggressive enforcement. The official argument: seizing these tankers disrupts criminal enterprises, not legitimate trade. Venezuela is portrayed as a narco state whose oil revenues fuel illegal activity. Venezuela and Russia reject this framing entirely. They see resource seizure disguised as law enforcement. Venezuela's government presents a very different narrative. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez has connected the tanker seizures to a broader pattern of aggression. She links them to the recent military attack on Venezuelan territory. She links them to the kidnapping of President Maduro and First Lady Cilia Flores. And she links them to what she calls a strategy of plunder, targeting Venezuelan oil. In this framing, the seizures confirm an ongoing economic war. Rodriguez frames these seizures as proof of U.S. intentions. She argues the United States wants to force regime change in Venezuela. The tanker seizures are one tool in this campaign. Military action is another. The arrest of Maduro is another. The goal, according to Caracas, is to seize Venezuela's oil resources. This narrative portrays Venezuela as a victim of imperial aggression, economic, military, and political. The Venezuelan government is using these events to promote national unity. The seizures are framed as attacks on all Venezuelans, not just the government. This resistance narrative calls for solidarity against foreign aggression. It portrays economic hardship as the result of U.S. actions, not government policy. The message to Venezuelans: your suffering is caused by Washington's blockade, not Caracas's decisions. The Dark Fleet disruptions feed directly into this messaging. Interestingly, Rodriguez also claims economic success. She has spoken of Venezuela's economic growth despite the blockade. This messaging serves a domestic political purpose. It tells Venezuelans that their country can survive U.S. pressure. It positions the government as successfully resisting foreign aggression. The tanker seizures complicate this narrative. Each captured vessel reduces actual oil revenues. The gap between claimed success and economic reality grows wider. The practical impact of these seizures is significant. Each captured tanker represents tens of millions of dollars in lost revenue. The cargo, sanctioned crude oil, will be confiscated by U.S. authorities. The ship itself may be sold or scrapped. The crew faces potential prosecution. More importantly, the operations create uncertainty across the entire Dark Fleet. Other operators now face dramatically increased risk. Insurance costs rise. Crews become harder to recruit. Routes become more dangerous. The seizures create a chilling effect across the dark fleet network. Tanker operators must now carefully calculate the risk of U.S. interception. Some may refuse to carry Venezuelan cargo entirely. Others may demand much higher payments to compensate for the danger. Shipping routes may change, adding costs and delays. The entire logistics chain supporting Venezuela's oil exports is disrupted. This is precisely what Washington intends. These operations represent a new phase in sanctions enforcement. Previous administrations relied primarily on financial penalties. Companies and individuals were designated for sanctions violations. Assets were frozen, access to the U.S. financial system was cut off, but physical interdiction of vessels at sea was relatively rare. Now, the United States is directly seizing ships on the ocean. This is a dramatic escalation of enforcement methods. The legal basis for these seizures raises serious questions. International maritime law generally protects vessels in international waters. The U.S. argues that stateless vessels, those not flying a recognized flag, have no such protection. Ships violating sanctions may also forfeit legal protections. But critics argue the U.S. is acting unilaterally as judge, jury, and executioner. These legal debates will continue in courts and diplomatic forums. Meanwhile, the seizures continue. The Marinara seizure in the North Atlantic demonstrates global reach. U.S. forces are not limiting operations to the Caribbean. They are tracking and intercepting vessels across ocean zones. The interception between Iceland and the U.K. proves a point. No dark fleet tanker is safe, regardless of route. Distance from Venezuela provides no protection. American intelligence and naval power can reach anywhere. The Marinara seizure fits President Trump's broader strategy. Maximum pressure on Venezuela includes multiple simultaneous elements. Military action, the capture of Maduro, removed political leadership. Economic sanctions restrict normal commerce. Maritime interdiction attacks the dark fleet alternative. Every tool is being employed at once. The goal is comprehensive pressure from all directions. Venezuela is being squeezed politically, economically, and now physically at sea. The question now is what comes next. Will Russia follow through on threats of military escorts? Will other dark fleet operators continue risking seizure? Will Venezuela's remaining oil revenue be sufficient to sustain the government? These questions will be answered in the coming weeks and months. The campaign against the dark fleet is ongoing. The Marinara will not be the last vessel seized. More interdictions are virtually certain. The pattern is unmistakable. The United States has launched a comprehensive campaign against Venezuela's dark fleet. The Marinara, formerly Bella 1, was seized in the North Atlantic between Iceland and the UK. Earlier seizures of the Skipper and Centuries established the precedent. The USS Gerald Ford Carrier Group provides overwhelming military muscle. Operation Southern Spear provides the operational framework. Russia calls it piracy. Venezuela calls it economic war. Washington calls it sanctions enforcement. The practical effect is the same regardless of terminology. Venezuela's ability to export oil is under direct attack. The dark fleet, once a reliable lifeline for evading sanctions, is now a liability. Ships are being seized. Cargo is being confiscated. Operators face unprecedented risk. This economic pressure complements the military and political pressure already applied. Maduro sits in a Brooklyn jail awaiting trial. His government's oil tankers are being intercepted at sea. The Trump administration shows no sign of relenting. The siege of Venezuela continues, on land and at sea. The world is watching.